She stepped off that stagecoach with 3 children clinging to her skirt and said the words out loud before he could even open his mouth. I know what you're thinking. No man wants a wife who comes with 3 children that aren't his. The man standing in the dust didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't make a single excuse to leave. And that one moment, was the beginning of the most unlikely family the Wyoming frontier had ever seen. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach had been running 6 hours late since Cheyenne. Nobody on board mentioned it out loud because nobody on board had the energy left to complain about anything. The road north had turned to mud somewhere around midday, and the driver had spent the better part of an hour coaxing 2 stubborn horses through a stretch that should have taken 15 minutes. Inside the coach, the heat was the kind that pressed against the lungs, thick, gritty, smelling of leather and sweat, and the particular misery of people who had been traveling too long in too small a space. Evelyn Brooks sat with her back straight against the wooden bench, which was a habit so deeply carved into her that she did it even when she was exhausted to the point of trembling. She had learned early in life that if you sat up straight, people assumed you were in control of something. It didn't matter what, just something. Her youngest, Clara, was asleep against her left side. 6 years old, small even for her age, with dark curls that had long since escaped their ribbon and were now plastered against her forehead with sweat. She was holding her cloth doll, a battered thing with button eyes and a seam running crookedly down one side, pressed so tightly against her chest that Evelyn had stopped trying to loosen her grip somewhere around the second hour. Clara slept the way she did everything, with absolute total commitment. Even unconscious, she held on. To Evelyn's right, her son Thomas had wedged himself into the corner of the bench and was staring out the window with an intensity that had nothing to do with anything actually visible outside. He was 8 years old and had spent most of the journey completely silent, which was not like him. Thomas, under normal circumstances, was the kind of child who asked questions continuously, not to be difficult, but because his mind genuinely moved faster than most adults found comfortable. Lately, though, he had gone quiet in a way that worried Evelyn more than any amount of noise ever had. He was thinking. She could see it in the set of his jaw, which was already starting to look like his father's jaw, and that was something she tried not to think about too long at a time. Across from them, on the opposite bench, sat Margaret, 14 years old, dark eyes, arms crossed, expression carefully, deliberately blank. Margaret was her firstborn, and the child Evelyn understood the least and worried about the most, which she suspected was probably true of most mothers and their oldest daughters. Margaret had stepped into a caretaker role the day Robert died, and she had never once been asked to do it. It had simply happened, the way water finds a crack in stone, naturally, inevitably, and not without damage. She had been 12 when her father's fever took him, and in the 2 years since she had quietly transformed herself into something that made Evelyn's chest ache to look at. A child who had decided that being needed was safer than being hurt. The woman sitting across from them, a heavy-set widow traveling to visit a son in Laramie, had given up trying to make conversation around the third hour and was now sleeping with her mouth slightly open, her bonnet pushed sideways on her head. Evelyn looked out the window. Wyoming territory. She had not expected it to be beautiful, but it was, in the indifferent way that places are beautiful when they don't particularly care whether you find them so. Rolling grassland stretched in every direction, broken by the occasional stand of cottonwood, and beyond that, the mountains sat low and blue on the horizon like a promise someone had made without explaining the terms. The sky was the color of a bruise healing, not quite right yet, but moving towards something. She had been told the ranch was 15 miles north of the town. She had been told the man's name was Graham Calloway, that he was 34 years old, that he owned 300 acres of good grazing land, that he had written the correspondence himself. She had been told all of this by the matchmaking service in St. Louis that had taken $14 of money she didn't really have. What she had not been told, what no one had thought to mention, was what she was supposed to feel sitting in a swaying stagecoach heading toward a man she had never met, with her 3 children pressed against her like small anchors. Scared was part of it. Desperate was most of it. And somewhere underneath both of those things, buried so deep she barely acknowledged it, was the thing she had least expected. A tiny, stubborn, absolutely inexplicable flicker of something that felt dangerously close to hope. She had stamped it down every time she noticed it. Hope was a luxury for people who could afford the cost of being wrong. Clara stirred against her side, made a small sound, and settled back into sleep. Evelyn closed her eyes. $14, she thought. This is what $14 buys. The town of Millhaven was not what she would have called impressive, but it had the dignified poverty of a place that was trying. There was a general store, a livery, a church with fresh paint on the door that hadn't made it to the rest of the building yet, 2 saloons, a barber shop, and a post office the size of a generous closet. The main street was unpaved and still soft from yesterday's rain, and when the stagecoach pulled up outside the stage office, Evelyn could hear the mud sucking at the wheels. "Millhaven," the driver called, in the tone of a man who had been saying the same thing for years and had long since stopped finding it interesting. The widow across from them jolted awake with a sharp sound, grabbed her bonnet, and began the complicated process of getting herself upright. Thomas pressed his face closer to the window. "Is this it?" "This is the town," Evelyn said. "The ranch is further." "How much further?" "I don't know exactly." "You said 15 miles. "I said I was told 15 miles. That's different." He looked at her. "That's the same thing." "Thomas," she kept her voice level, "help your sister." Clara was awake now, blinking slowly, clutching her doll and looking around with the slightly bewildered expression of a child who had learned to accept that waking up in unfamiliar places was simply something that happened. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried much since Robert died. Evelyn wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a very bad one. Margaret was already standing, straightening her dress with the brisk efficiency she brought to everything, her face still carefully arranged in that neutral expression. She picked up the smaller travel bag without being asked and waited. Outside, the street was bright and smelled of horse manure and pine sawdust and something frying somewhere that Evelyn couldn't identify. There were maybe a dozen people visible going about their business, and most of them glanced over at the arriving coach with the mild curiosity of people who lived somewhere small enough that new arrivals were still worth a look. And then she saw him. He was standing beside a wagon on the far side of the street, just outside the livery. Tall. Taller than she'd expected, though she hadn't known she'd had an expectation until it was exceeded. He had his hat in his hand, which meant he'd taken it off to be polite, though there was nothing about his posture that read as nervous. Brown hair going lighter at the temples, a face that had been outside in all kinds of weather for a long time. He was wearing a plain blue shirt and work trousers with worn knees, and he was watching the stagecoach with an expression she couldn't read from this distance. He wasn't what she'd imagined. She couldn't have said what she had imagined exactly, but it wasn't this. "Mama," Clara said, tugging at her sleeve. "Is that the man?" "I think so." "He's tall." "He is. Is he nice?" Evelyn didn't answer that because she didn't know the answer, and she had promised herself she would stop making promises she couldn't keep. Graham Calloway crossed the street toward them at an unhurried pace. He moved the way people move when they're comfortable in a space. No wasted motion, no awkwardness. When he got close enough, he nodded at her in a greeting that seemed genuine rather than performed. "Mrs. Brooks," he said. His voice was quieter than she'd expected. Even. Not unkind. "Mr. Calloway." She extended her hand, which he shook briefly. There was a pause. She could feel all 3 of her children arranged behind her like a small, quiet tribunal. And then, before she fully understood she was going to do it, the words came out. "I need to say something first." Her voice was steady. She had rehearsed this in her head somewhere around the 3rd hour of the journey. "Before anything else." He waited. "I know what the advertisement said," she told him. "It said widow, 2 children. That was what I wrote initially, and then the situation—" She stopped. Restarted. "I have 3 children, not 2. I should have corrected it sooner. I didn't, and I apologize for that because it wasn't fair to you." She paused. "No man wants a wife who comes with 3 children that aren't his. I understand if that changes things. I only ask that you say so now, so we're not standing here pretending." She had braced herself for any number of reactions. Irritation, a cool withdrawal. The particular kind of polite regret that men used when they had decided something but wanted to avoid unpleasantness. What she had not prepared for was the expression that crossed Graham Calloway's face, A sort of slow, quiet surprise, followed by something she might have called amusement if the situation weren't so serious. 3? He said. 3. She didn't look away. He glanced past her briefly, then back. Well, a pause. I've always wanted a large family. She stared at him. He said it plainly, without flourish, without the exaggerated sincerity of a man trying to say the right thing. He just said it the way you'd mention the weather, matter of fact, and without apparent need for her to respond in any particular way. Evelyn heard the words, she registered them, and then she filed them carefully into the category of things that sounded too good to be true, which in her experience was the only honest category for things that sounded too good to be true. Right, she said. Well, we should... The luggage. I'll get it. He turned toward the coach without any further ceremony. The wagon ride to the ranch took 40 minutes over a road that was more suggestion than fact in several places. Thomas sat beside Graham on the front bench and spent most of the journey firing questions at him with the determination of someone making up for hours of enforced silence. How many horses do you have? 7 right now, 2 mares due to foal in the spring. What kind? Quarter horses mostly, 1 Morgan. I've read about Morgans, Thomas said immediately. They're supposed to be very intelligent. The one I've got would agree with you. What's his name? Ezra. Thomas appeared to consider this seriously. That's a good name for a horse. I thought so. Evelyn sat in the wagon bed with her daughters, watching the exchange with a kind of complicated attention. She was observing Graham the way she might watch someone handling something fragile, waiting for the moment they got careless. He answered every question with the same unhurried patience, never shortening his responses to signal that he was done talking, never redirecting Thomas in a way that communicated the questions were too many. It was possible he was just polite. It was possible he was on his best behavior because the situation called for it. She had been married once, and she knew that men had reserves of patience they deployed during certain specific periods, and that those reserves were not infinite. She was aware that this was an uncharitable thought. She was also aware that she had earned the right to uncharitable thoughts. Clara, pressed against Evelyn's side, was watching the countryside pass with wide eyes. She hadn't said much since Millhaven. She did this sometimes, so she went quiet and observant after too much stimulation, filing things away in whatever part of her mind she used to make sense of the world. Mama, she said quietly. There are a lot of trees. There are. More than home. Evelyn didn't answer that, because the last place they'd called home was a rented 2-room house in St. Louis that had belonged to her brother-in-law, and they had lived there by his charity and left by his impatience, and she did not want to think about it. These are cottonwoods, mostly, Margaret said from Evelyn's other side, her tone careful, like she was offering information rather than attempting conversation. And those ones farther back are probably aspens. I read about Wyoming trees. Nobody responded to this immediately, and Margaret went back to looking at the horizon with her arms crossed. That was the thing about Margaret that Evelyn could never quite solve. She reached out and then retreated so fast it was almost impossible to meet her halfway. She would offer something, a fact, an observation, a small extension of herself. And then, before anyone could respond properly, she'd already folded back in. She's protecting herself, Evelyn thought, not for the first time. The same way I am. We just do it differently. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road, and it was not what Evelyn had pictured. She wasn't sure what she had pictured. Something more imposing, perhaps, or more ramshackle. The 2 most common options in the stories she'd heard about frontier homesteads. This was neither. It was simply a house. A solid 2-story house made of good timber with a covered porch running the length of the front, and 3 windows upstairs that caught the late afternoon sun. Behind it were a barn, a stable, a smaller outbuilding, and a fenced pasture where several horses moved with the lazy elegance of animals that had nothing pressing to do. It was not a beautiful house. The porch railing had been repaired recently and imperfectly. The new wood didn't match. One of the upstairs shutters was slightly crooked. The front step had a chip in it, but it was real and solid, and it looked like it intended to stay standing through whatever Wyoming chose to throw at it. "This is it," Graham said, pulling the horses to a stop. Nobody said anything for a moment. "It's big," Thomas said finally. Bigger than you need, living alone, Graham said, without any particular inflection. He climbed down and looped the reins. There's room! He said it like it was a practical statement, which Evelyn supposed it was. But practical statements had a way of carrying other things inside them when you paid attention. There's room. She had been told for 2 years, in ways large and small, that there wasn't. She helped Clara down from the wagon and stood in the yard, looking at the house. The evening air smelled of dry grass and pine, and something sweet she couldn't identify. Probably wildflowers somewhere beyond the fence line. A dog appeared around the side of the barn, tail waving at the moderate, dignified pace of an animal who had decided enthusiasm was beneath him and came to investigate. Clara sucked in a breath. Is that your dog? Thomas asked, already sliding off the wagon. That's Button, Graham said. Thomas looked at the dog. A large, gray-muzzled mutt with floppy ears and the broad chest of something that had several different breeds in its history and hadn't sorted any of them out. He doesn't look like a Button. He didn't name himself. Thomas, against what appeared to be his better judgment, smiled. The inside of the house was clean in the specific way of places kept clean by someone who lived alone. Systematically, without warmth. Every surface was clear. The kitchen had all its tools in order. The floors had been swept recently. There were no decorative touches, no small objects chosen for sentimental reasons, no evidence that anyone had ever put something somewhere just because they liked how it looked. Functional. That was the word. It was a functional house, and it had been waiting. Graham showed them through it quickly and without ceremony, pointing out what was where. Kitchen, sitting room. A study with a desk and a wall of books that Evelyn noticed Thomas catalog immediately, and with great interest. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms. 3. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the first one and did the arithmetic that she'd been doing since she'd known there were 3 bedrooms. 1 for herself, presumably, until the situation was formalized. 1 for the girls to share. 1 for Thomas. The rooms were simply furnished. A bed, a chest of drawers, a rag rug on the floor. Clean linens folded on the mattresses. I didn't know about the youngest, Graham said from behind her, and she realized he meant the sleeping arrangements, not a criticism. There are extra blankets in the chest. We can sort out whatever's needed. We. Such a small word to carry so much weight. This is fine, she said. This is more than adequate, Mr. Calloway. Graham, he said. She turned. I'm sorry? Mr. Calloway is my father. Was. He paused. Graham's easier. She nodded once. Graham. It felt strange in her mouth, like wearing shoes that were the right size but hadn't been broken in yet. Dinner that evening was an event that fell somewhere between awkward and unremarkable, which, Evelyn supposed, was probably the best that could be hoped for. She had offered to cook, partly from habit, partly because she needed something to do with her hands. Graham had accepted without argument, which told her either that he was being accommodating or that he was a practical man who appreciated not having to cook after a day that had presumably involved a trip to town and back. She couldn't tell which yet. She made salt pork and beans and cornbread from what was in the kitchen, which wasn't much but was enough. And the children ate with the focused attention of people who have been hungry and recently fed and are not yet sure when the next meal is. Graham ate with them, which was, she realized, the thing she had been bracing for without admitting it, that he would eat separately, that there would be some invisible line maintained. There wasn't. He sat at the end of the table and ate his beans, and when Thomas asked him what the horses were like in winter, he explained it clearly and without shortening the answer. When Clara dropped her spoon and it clattered under the table, he retrieved it and handed it back without making a thing of it. When Margaret said nothing and ate looking at her plate, he didn't push, didn't attempt to engage her with the forced warmth that adults sometimes deployed at children they needed to like them. He just left her alone, which, Evelyn suspected, was exactly the right move, even if she wasn't sure he'd made it deliberately. After supper, Clara discovered that Button had apparently been allowed inside and was sleeping under the kitchen table, and spent the remaining pre-bedtime hour in a state of quiet rapture, sitting on the floor beside the dog with her cloth doll in her lap, talking to him in a low, companionable murmur that required no response. Thomas had stationed himself in front of the bookshelf in the sitting room and was reading the titles with the reverent attention of someone visiting a very important museum. "Can I read one?" he asked, not to anyone in particular. Which one? Graham said from the kitchen doorway. There's one about natural history. Take it. Thomas looked up. Really? Books aren't much use sitting on a shelf. Margaret had disappeared upstairs. Evelyn found her later, sitting on the edge of the bed in the room she'd be sharing with Clara, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing in particular. You all right? Evelyn asked. Fine. Evelyn sat down beside her. The mattress was better than anything they'd slept on in a long time. It's a lot to take in, she said. I'm not overwhelmed, Margaret said, with the specific 14-year-old precision of someone distinguishing between different emotional states they were not willing to admit to. I didn't say you were. A pause. He has a lot of books, Margaret said. He does. That's... She stopped, started again. Most ranchers don't have many books. I expect most ranchers are busy. He must read at night. Evelyn didn't answer. She was thinking about the house, and the 3 bedrooms that had been waiting, and the man who had said, I've always wanted a large family, like it was simply a true thing that was now true. Get some sleep, she said instead, and kissed Margaret on the top of her head, which Margaret tolerated with the long-suffering dignity she brought to most displays of affection. She didn't sleep well, which was not a surprise. She lay in the dark of a bedroom that was not hers and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was not hers, in a territory that was not hers, and did what she did in the quiet. She made calculations. She had gotten good at calculations over the past 2 years, not the mathematical kind, though she'd gotten better at those too, because necessity had required it. The other kind. The kind where you assessed what you had, what you owed, what you were likely to be given, and what it was going to cost you. She had $14 left, minus the stage fare, so closer to $6. She had the clothes on her children's backs and a few changes besides. She had skills. She could cook, sew, keep a house, manage a garden, keep accounts well enough. She had 3 children who were, on balance, reasonably well behaved, given the circumstances. What she did not have was any foundation upon which to trust that this situation was what it appeared to be. That was the calculation she kept returning to, in the dark, in a bedroom that was not hers. Graham Calloway had said all the right things. He had done all the right things, so far, for the space of a single afternoon and evening, which proved essentially nothing. Robert had done all the right things too, in the beginning. Not because he was dishonest. He hadn't been, not deliberately. But people had limits, and they didn't always know what those limits were until they were reached. And she had spent enough of the last 2 years existing at the edge of other people's patience to know that the edge was always closer than it looked. She was not going to presume. She was not going to assume. She was going to be useful and unobtrusive and grateful, and she was going to keep her children quiet and her requests minimal, and she was going to make sure that when he reached the limits of his patience, because he would, because everyone did, she had done nothing to hasten it. That was the plan. That was what she had decided before the stagecoach left Cheyenne, and nothing about one afternoon in Wyoming had changed it. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind move through the cottonwoods, which was a sound she didn't know yet, and told herself that hope was not a strategy. The first full morning was a Wednesday. Evelyn was up before anyone else, before the children, before Graham, and had the kitchen fire going by the time the sky outside was barely light. She found flour and eggs and the remnants of a smoked ham in the cold box, and she made biscuits, which was the closest thing to a peace offering she knew how to make. She was cutting the dough when Graham appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped when he saw her. She could tell he hadn't expected it. You didn't have to do that, he said. I was awake. She kept her hands moving. Do you take coffee? Yes. He came into the kitchen, moved around her with careful distance, and began working on the coffee himself with the ease of habit. Did you sleep? Adequately. She didn't look up from the biscuits. You? Fine. A pause. The beds are... There's more I want to do with the upstairs rooms. They're sparse. They're fine. They're sparse, he said again, simply, like he was just acknowledging a fact. I'll get to it. Evelyn put the biscuits in the cast iron and didn't say anything. She had learned to be careful with kindness that arrived voluntarily, without her asking for it. Not because kindness was bad, but because she had noticed, over time, that voluntarily offered kindness had a tendency to come with a shelf life. It felt good to give and receive at first. Then the giving got heavier. Then the receiving started to feel like a debt. Thomas appeared at the kitchen door, barefoot, hair sticking up on one side, with the natural history book already in his hand. "Can I go to the stable?" he asked Graham. "After breakfast," Graham said. Thomas looked at the biscuits cooling on the rack and appeared to do the calculation. "Okay." "Are you always up this early?" Graham asked him. "Usually." Thomas came the rest of the way into the kitchen and climbed onto a chair. "I wake up thinking about things." "What kinds of things?" Thomas considered this question with genuine seriousness. "Different things. Today I was thinking about how horses sleep. It said in the book they can sleep standing up because of something in their legs, a passive mechanism." "Stay apparatus," Graham said. Thomas looked up fast. "You know about it." "I work with horses." "Most people who work with horses don't know the scientific name for things. Most people aren't interested in the scientific name." "But you are." Graham poured his coffee, and there was a slight pause before he answered. "I'm interested in how things work, how most things work. Horses, land, weather." He took a sip. "People." Thomas looked at him with an expression that Evelyn recognized, the one he made when someone had said something that was going into the permanent file. "That's interesting," he said, which from Thomas was the highest form of compliment. Clara came downstairs then, in her nightgown, carrying her doll, and Button appeared from wherever he'd been sleeping and came to greet her in the way he'd apparently decided was their arrangement now, which was to walk alongside her at a measured distance and then sit down near her feet when she stopped moving. Clara accepted this gravely and took her seat at the table. "Good morning," Graham said to her. "Good morning," she said. Then, "My doll's name is June." "Good morning, June," he said. Clara looked at him for a moment, evaluating something. Then she gave a small, decisive nod, as though he'd passed a test she hadn't announced. The first week was a study in negotiation. Unspoken, mostly, but constant. Evelyn negotiated this kitchen, which she took over entirely because it needed someone to take it over, and because having somewhere defined to be useful helped with the anxiety of being somewhere undefined. She cooked 3 meals a day, kept the larder organized, and learned the particular rhythms of what Graham ate and when, which told her things about him that she filed away automatically because she had always been good at learning what people needed in order to make herself useful to them. He ate simply and without complaint, which was a relief. He didn't linger over meals, but he didn't rush them either. He ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent a lot of time eating alone and hadn't developed the habit of making it into anything more than fuel. She noticed that he always left the last biscuit on the plate. She thought at first it was manners, the polite gesture of someone raised to leave something for others. But after the 3rd morning, she realized he just wasn't paying attention. He'd eaten enough, so he stopped. He wasn't performing, wasn't calculating the impression. He simply stopped when he was done. That small observation did something to her calculations. She couldn't have said precisely what. Thomas, meanwhile, was navigating his own set of negotiations with Graham that operated on a completely separate frequency. By the 3rd morning, he had moved from asking questions in the kitchen to asking questions in the stable, which required following Graham to the stable, which Graham appeared to have no objection to. By the 4th day, Thomas was helping with the morning feed, which was not help in any strictly useful sense. He dropped more grain than he managed to direct, but which Graham accepted with the patience of a man who understood that incompetence was temporary and enthusiasm was worth preserving. "He asked me 47 questions yesterday," Graham said to Evelyn at the end of the 4th day, in a tone she spent a moment trying to read. "He does that," she said. "I'm sorry if it's—" "I counted," Graham said. "I had to start counting around question 15 so I didn't lose track." A pause. "He's going to know more about horses than I do if he keeps at it." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and the expression on his face was— she catalogued it carefully, because she needed to be careful with what she thought she saw. It was something close to delighted. Not performed, not arranged for her benefit, genuinely, quietly delighted. She looked back at the pot she was stirring and told herself not to read too much into a man's expression. Clara, for her part, had made her feelings about the situation known in the wordless, absolute way that 6-year-olds communicate. She liked Button. She liked the horses when Thomas was permitted to introduce her to them at a safe distance, and she had decided that the large room at the top of the stairs that got the afternoon sun was the best place in the house to sit and have conversations with June. She had not yet decided how she felt about Graham specifically. She watched him with the careful, unblinking attention of a child who had learned early that adults were worth studying before trusting. He appeared to understand this on some level because he didn't push. He said good morning and good evening and answered her direct questions and otherwise let her reach whatever conclusions she was reaching at her own pace. Margaret was the most complicated. Margaret sat at the table and ate what was put in front of her and spoke when spoken to and helped without being asked, and was, by any external measure, perfectly well behaved. She also maintained a posture of such comprehensive invisibility that Evelyn watched her sometimes and felt a hollowing fear, not that something bad would happen, but that something already had, something she hadn't been able to prevent, some essential part of Margaret that had gone quiet 2 years ago and hadn't come back. On the 5th day, she found Graham in the sitting room after supper, attempting to fix something on the front windowsill that had come loose. The light was going, and he was squinting at the work, and Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "She's not unfriendly," she said. "Margaret, she's—" He looked up. "I know." He went back to the windowsill. "She's watching." "Yes." "That's fair." A pause while he applied pressure to the loose joint. "She doesn't know me." "No, nobody should trust someone they don't know." He pressed the wood into place. "I'll have to earn it." Evelyn looked at him. "That's just how it works," he said, without any particular drama, like he was explaining something self-evident. "You don't ask people to trust you. You act in ways that make trust the reasonable conclusion." She stood there for a moment after he said it, and she felt something shift slightly, in some internal architecture she'd thought was settled. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in stories. More like how a floorboard settles when the temperature changes. A small, almost inaudible adjustment. She went back to the kitchen. She had dishes to finish. The thing about the ranch that Evelyn had not anticipated was how much work there was. Not her work specifically. She understood her work. She had worked hard all her life in the unromantic, everyday way of women who had responsibilities and no one else to meet them. But the ranch had a kind of work that was different from anything she'd done before, a scale and a rhythm that she had to learn from the outside in, because it wasn't her territory yet. She started observing it the way she'd learned to observe everything, quietly, from a slight distance, cataloging without interpreting until she had enough information. Graham was up before the sun every morning. She could hear him. The particular sound of boots on floorboards, the back door, the distant sound from the stable. He was back at the house for breakfast, then out again, then back for the midday, then working until the light failed. He did all of this without complaint or announcement. It was simply what the work required, and he did it. She noticed his hands. They were a working man's hands, roughened, calloused, with the particular permanent wear of someone who had been doing physical labor their whole adult life. They were also, she noticed when he repaired Clara's doll on the 6th day, capable of extremely careful work. Clara had come to dinner with June tucked under her arm, and Evelyn had noticed, with a small, sick lurch, that the seam along June's side had opened, a split about 2 inches long, with the cloth stuffing beginning to push through. It was the kind of repair that looked simple and wasn't. After dinner, she had turned to find the sewing kit with the half-formed plan to fix it herself before Clara noticed, and instead found Graham sitting at the table with the doll in his hands, squinting at the split seam with the same focused attention he'd applied to the windowsill joint. "I can do that," Evelyn said immediately. "I've got it," he said. "It needs fine needlework. The cloth is thin. I've mended tack before." He was already threading the needle, holding it up to the lamplight with the expression of a man who is not going to be persuaded out of something. "It's not so different." It was, in fact, somewhat different. Evelyn watched, ready to intervene, and saw him make 4 stitches that were, she would not call them skilled, she would call them determined. They were uneven, slightly too big, crossing in patterns that no seamstress would have approved of. But they were firm. That seam wasn't going to open again. Clara appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, saw what was happening, and went completely still. Graham looked up. "Finished," he said, and held June out toward her. Clara came forward slowly. She took the doll and turned her over, examining the repair. The stitches really were quite uneven. Evelyn held her breath for a moment. Clara had strong opinions about her things. "Thank you," Clara said, with the grave formality she used when something mattered. She held June against her chest and went upstairs. Graham looked at the needle and thread remaining in his hand, then set them on the table. "The stitches are crooked," he said. "They're firm," Evelyn said. He nodded once, in the manner of a man filing that away as sufficient. On the 10th day, Margaret came into the kitchen while Evelyn was making supper and stood at the work table without any apparent purpose. Evelyn waited. "He fixed the shutter," Margaret said. "What shutter?" "Upstairs, the one that was crooked." A pause. "He did it this afternoon. I don't think he knew I was up there." Evelyn turned this over. "How did you know he didn't know?" "He was talking to himself." Margaret almost smiled. "Arguing with the hinge." Evelyn went back to peeling the potatoes. "Was he winning?" "Eventually." Margaret picked up a carrot from the pile on the table and put it down again. He doesn't do things to be noticed, does he?" "It seems that way. Robert used to do that." She said her father's name carefully, the way she always did, not avoiding it, but not casual either. He'd fix something and then mention it, not in a bad way. Just, he'd say he did it. "Graham doesn't mention it," Evelyn said. "No." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure what to do with that." Evelyn looked at her daughter, 14 years old, trying to make sense of a world that kept rearranging itself without her permission. "I'm not sure either," she said honestly. Margaret seemed to appreciate the honesty more than any reassurance would have landed. She picked up a knife and started peeling the carrot, and they worked side by side in the kitchen in the particular silence of people who had just said something true. That night, after the children were in bed, Evelyn sat on the front porch steps. The stars over Wyoming were more than she'd ever seen in one place, more than she'd known could exist in a sky, thick and scattered, and indifferent in the specific way that immensity is indifferent without being unkind. She heard the front door behind her, and Graham sat down on the step a few feet away. He had a mug of something, coffee probably, though she'd have advised against it this late. He stretched his legs out and looked up at the same sky. Neither of them said anything for a few minutes. "This is probably not what you expected," she said finally. He thought about this, which she appreciated. He didn't rush to reassure her. "No," he said. "It's different. I imagine a man writes to a matchmaking service expecting something—" She stopped. "Something simpler." "I didn't expect simple," he said. "Simple was what I had before. Simple was the ranch by myself and dinner alone and the same four walls." He took a drink from the mug. "I didn't want more simple." She looked at the stars and thought about that. "They're good children," he said. "They are," she agreed. "The boy is extraordinary," he said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not excessive, not the deliberate compliment of a man trying to be liked. Just plain recognition. "I haven't talked to anyone that curious in a long time." She felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly, against her best intentions. She put it back. "I keep waiting," she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. He looked at her. "For something to go wrong," she said. "For the cost of all this to appear. There's always a cost. I'm keeping track of everything I owe you, in my head, and I can't—" She stopped. She hadn't meant to say any of that. "I'm sorry, that was honest," he said. She looked at the ground. "You've been keeping inventory," he said, not unkindly, "of debts." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not running a ledger." "I know that's what you'd say. It's also what's true." He set the mug down on the step beside him. "I'm not, Evelyn, I'm not keeping score. There's nothing to score. You came here. You're here. So are they. That's what I asked for." She wanted to believe it. That was the most frightening part, how much she wanted to believe it, and how clearly she understood that wanting to believe something had nothing to do with whether it was safe to. She stood up. "Good night, Graham." "Good night." She went inside and she stood in the dark kitchen for a moment before going upstairs, and she pressed her hand flat against the wall, the solid timber wall of a house that had been standing through Wyoming winters for years and gave no indication of stopping. She had 14 days left until the marriage was to be formalized, if she agreed to it. She was not going to decide tonight. She had promised herself she would not decide anything quickly, and she was going to keep that promise even when the house felt real under her hand and the sky was full of more stars than she had words for. She went upstairs and lay in the dark and listened to the cottonwoods. She did not sleep for a long time, but for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Millhaven, she was not calculating. She was just lying there, in the dark, being still. Which was, she supposed, something. The second week settled over the ranch the way weather settles. Not all at once, but gradually, until you looked up one morning and realized the temperature had changed without you noticing the moment it happened. Evelyn had established a routine, which was the first thing she always did in any new situation, because routine was the scaffolding that held everything else up. She was in the kitchen before light. Breakfast by the time Graham came in from the morning stable check. Dishes, then the house, sweeping, washing, whatever needed attention. Midday meal. Afternoons she used for mending or the kitchen garden she'd found behind the house, which had been planted by someone at some point and then left to manage itself, and was doing so with mixed results. Supper. Evenings on whatever needed doing. The children had their own rhythms settling in beside hers. Thomas was at the stable most mornings now, having graduated from dropping grain to actually being useful in small ways. Filling water troughs, brushing the two gentler mares, carrying things from one place to another with the focused diligence of a child who wanted to prove he was worth keeping around. Graham had started explaining things to him while they worked, not as formal lessons, but as the running commentary of someone who thought out loud as a habit, and Thomas absorbed it all with the intensity of someone who had been waiting his whole life for someone to take his questions seriously. Clara had claimed the afternoon sunroom as her domain and held court there most days with June and Button, who had taken to following her around the house with the devoted resignation of a dog, who has decided his new purpose in life is to be the audience for a 6-year-old's extended dramatic monologues. Evelyn could hear her sometimes, through the floorboards, the low, serious murmur of a child explaining the world to a cloth doll and a patient gray-muzzled dog, and it was the closest thing to peace she'd felt in 2 years. Margaret was the one who kept her up at night. Not because anything was wrong with Margaret exactly. Margaret was doing everything right. She helped without being asked. She kept her room neat. She was polite to Graham with the careful, measured politeness of someone who had decided on an exact distance and was maintaining it with precision. She did all of this so thoroughly, so competently, that Evelyn sometimes found herself watching her daughter across the supper table and feeling a hollow ache that she couldn't quite name. The problem was not what Margaret did. The problem was what Margaret didn't do. She didn't laugh. She didn't argue. Not even the ordinary low-level arguing that was simply part of being 14. She didn't make the small, unnecessary observations that children make when they feel comfortable enough to take up space with their thoughts. She had been performing careful smallness for so long now that Evelyn wasn't sure she knew how to stop, or whether she'd even noticed she was doing it. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, 12 days after their arrival, that the first crack appeared. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden, attempting to reason with a row of carrots that had come up crooked. She could hear the stable from here, the particular sound of Graham working with one of the horses, the low commands, the occasional movement. What she did not expect to hear was Thomas's voice rising above it, high and urgent. She was at the stable door in under a minute. Thomas was standing near the far wall, back pressed against the wood, eyes wide. Graham was between him and the horse, the Morgan, Ezra, who was dancing sideways in the stall with the focused agitation of an animal that had decided something was wrong and wasn't done deciding. Graham had one hand on the stall rail and was speaking in a low, continuous, completely level voice that was doing the work of keeping the situation from being worse. "Don't move," Graham said to Thomas, without turning around. "Just stay still. He's going to settle." I was just trying to, psst. I know, stay still." Ezra's ears went back, then forward, then back again. Graham moved slowly, incrementally, into the stall, still talking. Not words particularly, just sound, consistent and calm, the vocal equivalent of something solid to hold on to. The horse's dancing slowed more. His head came down a degree. It took about 4 minutes, which felt longer. When it was over, when Ezra had gone back to merely suspicious rather than actively alarmed, and Graham had come back out of the stall and latched it. Thomas let out a breath that had been waiting since Evelyn walked in. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I dropped the bucket. I didn't mean to. It just slipped." "Loud sounds spook him," Graham said. His voice was still level, but Evelyn could hear, now that the emergency was past, a slight tension in it. Not anger, exactly. Something more like adrenaline finding nowhere to go. "I should have told you that before today." Thomas blinked. You're not angry? At the bucket? At me." Graham looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man organizing his thoughts carefully. "You didn't drop it on purpose. You made a mistake and I hadn't prepared you for the consequence of that particular mistake. That's on me, not you." Thomas stared at him. In Evelyn's experience, Thomas processed most things quickly, but this one seemed to require extra time. "Robert, my father—" He stopped. "You don't have to Graham started. "He didn't get angry much either," Thomas said, pushing through whatever had made him hesitate. "But when something went wrong, he'd get quiet, like he was disappointed, and that was worse than angry." The stable was very quiet for a moment. "I'm not disappointed," Graham said simply. "You made a noise near a horse who doesn't like noise. Now you know." He picked up the bucket from where it had rolled against the wall, set it upright. "Next time you'll hold it with both hands." Thomas looked at the bucket. "Next time," he repeated, like the phrase itself contained something important. "If you want there to be a next time," Graham added. "That part's up to you." Thomas looked up at him, and the expression on his face was something Evelyn wasn't sure she'd seen on him before. Not excitement, which was his default, but something quieter. Something like recognition. "I want there to be a next time," he said. "Then go wash up for lunch," Graham said, and went back to the stall. Evelyn stepped back from the doorway before Thomas saw her standing there, and returned to her crooked carrots and said nothing to anyone about what she'd seen. But she stood in the garden for a while without actually working, and she thought about Thomas's face, and the particular expression that came with someone realizing that consequences and punishment were not, in fact, the same thing. She had thought she was teaching her children that. She had tried. But there was something different about watching a man who was not their father demonstrate it without performing it, without knowing he was being observed, without any apparent awareness that he was doing something worth noting. The kitchen garden blurred slightly. She pressed the back of her wrist against her eye and got back to work. She was not going to cry in the carrot row. That was where she drew the line. 12 days in, and the line kept moving without her permission. The days had a way of accumulating detail. Small things, individually meaningless, that she kept adding to a pile without quite deciding what the pile was for. Graham waking up one morning to find the kitchen cold because she'd overslept for the first time in memory, and making the fire himself without mentioning it. The way he handed Clara her chair at the table without thinking about it. Just picked it up and moved it into position when she came in, as naturally as breathing. The evening he came in from the north pasture with a tear in his shirt that she repaired without asking, and his brief thank you that was quiet and direct and had nothing in it of performance. What she was building, she realized, was a record. A careful, unsentimental record of actions that required no audience. Things done in the absence of observation, which were the only actions that told you anything real about a person. She was not yet sure what the record was telling her, but she was keeping it. It was Margaret who complicated the record in the way that Margaret complicated everything, suddenly, without warning, in a way that landed harder than expected. It was a Thursday, 17 days in. Evelyn had gone upstairs early with a headache that had been building since midday, the kind that settled behind one eye and made everything too bright. She lay in her room in the gray late afternoon light and tried to think about nothing, which was not something she was good at. Through the floor, muffled but audible, she could hear the sitting room below. Graham's voice. Then, after a pause that surprised her, Margaret's. She lay still and listened. She couldn't make out words clearly, just the rhythm of it. The exchange, the pause, the exchange again. Graham's voice was the same steady, low, even she'd gotten used to. Margaret's had a different quality than it did at the table. Less careful, less arranged. Evelyn didn't go downstairs. She stayed where she was, headache pressing behind her eye, and let it happen without intervening. Later, at supper, She watched Margaret and saw something she'd almost forgotten existed. The slight relaxing of the shoulders. The near invisible lowering of whatever Margaret carried around in the set of her posture that had been there since her father died and hadn't moved. She didn't ask about it. She understood at some fundamental level that some things needed to happen outside of her supervision. After supper, once the children were upstairs, she found Graham at the sink. "What did you two talk about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, washing a pan. "Books, mostly." She asked about the history ones on the shelf. He set the pan on the rack. "She reads." "She does. She's good at it. She said she used to have more books before." He didn't elaborate on before, which meant he'd understood what before meant. "I told her anything on the shelf was hers to borrow." Evelyn thought about her daughter's shoulders at supper, the slight release in them. "She didn't ask me if she could," she said, mostly to herself. "No," Graham said. "She asked me." He was quiet for a moment. "I think that's what she needed, to ask for something herself and find out it wasn't a problem." Evelyn looked at the window over the sink, where the dark outside turned the glass into something like a mirror. She could see the vague shape of both of them in it, standing in a lit kitchen. She looked like herself, she thought, more herself than she'd looked in a long time. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she picked up a dish towel and dried the pan, and neither of them said anything else. 3 days later, Claire got sick. It started small, the way these things always did. A slight drag to her movements at breakfast. A listlessness that didn't suit her. Evelyn put her hand to Claire's forehead out of habit, and then kept it there. And then her stomach dropped with a cold, specific recognition. Fever. "How high?" Graham said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. "I don't know, I don't—" She pressed her lips together. "She's warm. She was fine last night." "Upstairs," he said. "I'll get—" "She was fine," Evelyn said, and her voice came out sharper than she'd meant, because she was doing the thing she'd promised herself she wouldn't do. She was already inside the memory, already back in the room in St. Louis, where Robert had been fine, and then not there at all, and her body had responded to the fever in Claire's skin the way it responded to all things that resembled that, with a kind of cold, clenching dread that bypassed reason entirely. Graham didn't react to the sharpness. "Evelyn," his voice was quiet and direct, "let's get her upstairs first. One thing at a time." Clara went up between them, one hand in Evelyn's, the other holding June with the grip of a child who understood, on some dim instinctive level, that things had shifted. She was already more lethargic than she'd been 10 minutes ago, her eyes heavier, her small body radiating heat like a coal. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and pulled Clara's shoes off, and her hands were shaking, which she noticed and could not stop. "I'll ride for the doctor," Graham said from the doorway. "It might just be—" "I'll ride for the doctor," he said again. Not a question. She looked at him. He was already looking back at her with the expression of a man who had made a decision and wasn't going to perform uncertainty about it. "Nearest one is 12 miles, she said. "I know where he is." He picked up his hat from the chair near the door. "Keep her cool. There's a cloth in the kitchen, bottom drawer. Wet it." He was gone before she finished saying "Graham." She sat on the edge of Claire's bed and listened to the sound of him saddling a horse in the dark yard below, and then the fading sound of hooves on the packed dirt, and then nothing but the wind and Clara's uneven breathing. Thomas appeared in the doorway, pale. "What's wrong with her?" "She has a fever. She's going to be fine." Evelyn said this with complete authority, which she did not feel, because the alternative, allowing fear into her voice in front of a child who was already frightened, was not available to her. Where did Graham go? "For the doctor." Thomas absorbed this. "He went in the dark?" "Yes." "It's 12 miles." "I know." She could hear him breathing from the doorway. Is there something I should do?" "Go get the lamp from the hall and bring it here," she said, because giving him a task was more honest than telling him everything was fine and sending him back to bed. He went, and she got the cloth from the kitchen and came back and sat beside Clara in the small circle of lamplight, and she pressed the cool cloth to her daughter's forehead and told herself one thing at a time. Margaret appeared sometime in the next hour and sat in the chair by the window without asking permission and without speaking, and they stayed like that. The three of them, Evelyn on the bed, Thomas cross-legged on the floor with the natural history book open in his lap, but not reading it. Margaret in the chair with her arms wrapped around herself, until the sound of hooves in the yard broke the silence just before midnight. Graham came back with a doctor named Aldridge, who was older than Evelyn had expected and moved with the unhurried competence of someone who had seen a great deal of sick children and had stopped being alarmed by most of them. He examined Clara with careful efficiency, asked 3 precise questions, and delivered his verdict in the tone of a man who understood that panic helped no one. Chest fever, not severe. Fluids, cool cloths, rest. Watch through the night and through tomorrow. Likely to break on its own within 48 hours if the lungs stayed clear. If the lungs didn't stay clear, he left his instructions, and Evelyn heard them and stored them and focused on breathing evenly until he was done. After Aldridge left, Graham had ridden back with him to see him safely onto the main road. Evelyn was alone with Clara again, and she sat in the chair Margaret had vacated, and she let herself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, everything she'd been holding back for the past 2 hours. The terror, the memory of Robert, the cold specific knowledge of how fast a person could go from warm to not there. 60 seconds. Then she breathed out and went back to the cloth and the lamp and the work of watching. Graham came back around 1 in the morning. She heard him downstairs quiet, not stomping in, not announcing himself, just the soft evidence of someone being careful not to wake children. Boots on the stair, slow. He appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her without asking if she wanted it, then pulled the wooden chair from the corner and sat down on the far side of the bed. "She's sleeping," Evelyn said. "Good." He looked at Clara's face, flushed, slightly damp from the cloths, but breathing steadily. Dr. Aldridge said she looked stronger than he expected. "He told you that separately?" "On the road." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "Said she's got constitution." Evelyn looked at her daughter's small face. "She's survived a lot," she said. "She doesn't make noise about it, but she has." Graham nodded once, slowly, like he was filing that away. They sat in the room together and didn't talk much, which was something Evelyn had always considered a significant test of 2 people's compatibility, whether silence between them had weight or peace. This silence was not entirely peaceful. There was too much fear still in the room for peace. But it wasn't heavy with performance either. It was just 2 people in a room with a sick child, and the night outside and the lamp burning steadily between them. Around 2, she said, "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her. "Ride for him. In the dark. She's sick," he said, in the tone of someone explaining something obvious. "You don't wait on a sick child. She's not your child," Evelyn said, and then felt immediately the particular cruelty of the words, even though she hadn't meant them as cruel. She had meant them as true, as a thing that was simply factual, the acknowledgement of a category that seemed to matter to most people in ways she had learned to anticipate. Graham looked at her for a moment. His expression didn't change much. Then he looked back at Clara. "She's in my house," he said. "She's sick. That's enough." Evelyn held the coffee mug and looked at the lamp flame and thought about what it meant that he'd said that. Not she's going to be my family or I'm her father now. Nothing that claimed a future that hadn't been established yet. Just the clean, uncomplicated logic of it. She's here. She's sick. That's enough. She thought about her 60 seconds of fear earlier. She thought about Robert's fever and the 3 rooms in that house in St. Louis and the 2 years of existing on the charity of a man who had been kind enough in ways that had always felt like loans. She did not say anything. She sat with the coffee and the lamp and Graham across the bed from her, and the silence shifted, barely, into something she didn't quite have a word for yet. Clara's fever broke at dawn, 48 hours almost to the hour after it had started, and Evelyn was there for the moment it happened. The slight loosening of the child's body, the deep unconscious sigh that came with temperature dropping, the way her face unclenched from the tight misery of fever and went soft and slack with proper sleep. Evelyn put her forehead down on the edge of the mattress and stayed there for a moment, and she was shaking again, but differently. She heard the chair scrape as Graham stood up, heard him move around the bed, felt his hand land briefly on her shoulder. Once, solid, not lingering. And then he went downstairs to start the fire for breakfast. She stayed there a moment longer. Claire's breathing was slow and even and real. "She's here," she thought. "She's still here." She stood up. She went to the window and looked at the early light coming over the mountains, which was the same as it had been the morning before and would be the same tomorrow. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, which was cold, and felt the cold, and decided that was enough for this moment. She had not allowed herself in the 48 hours since the fever started to think about what it meant that he'd gone for the doctor at midnight without being asked, or that he'd come back and sat through the night without complaint, or that he'd looked at Clara sleeping and not counted what it cost him. She thought about it now, briefly. Then she folded it up and put it somewhere careful. She went downstairs to help with breakfast. Thomas was already in the kitchen. He looked up when she came in, and whatever he saw on her face must have told him what he needed to know, because his own face went loose with a relief so sharp it was almost painful to watch. "She's okay," Evelyn said. Thomas put his hands over his face. "Just for a second." Then he lowered them and blinked hard and turned back to the table, and when Graham said, "Thomas, hand me that pan," he did it immediately and without speaking, which was the most un-Thomas thing she'd ever seen, and which told her everything about how frightened he'd been. Margaret came down last. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Evelyn and said nothing. She just looked. "She's sleeping," Evelyn said. "Good sleep. Her fever broke." Margaret nodded. She crossed the kitchen and sat down in her chair and looked at her hands on the table, and Evelyn saw her jaw work once, silently. She reached over and put her hand briefly over Margaret's. Margaret turned her hand over and held it back, which was not something she did, and which lasted only a few seconds before she pulled away and reached for her glass. But it happened. Evelyn kept it. Breakfast that morning was the quietest meal they'd had at the ranch. Nobody had much to say. But there was something in the quiet that was different from the careful, managed silence of the first week. That silence had been performance, everyone maintaining distance, everyone on their best behavior, everyone holding themselves just so. This one was different. This one was the silence of people who had been through something together, however small, and were sitting on the other side of it without needing to talk about it. Graham ate his food and drank his coffee and didn't say much. And when Thomas eventually started asking questions again, small ones, tentative, like he was testing whether the world had returned to its regular operations, Graham answered them in the same measured way he always did, and the morning moved forward, which was what mornings did. Clara slept until midday, and when she woke up she wanted broth and June and Button in that order, and she got all three, and she held her doll and ran her fingers over the crooked stitches on June's side the way she sometimes did when she was thinking. "Graham fixed her," she told Evelyn. "He did." Clara looked at the stitches. "They're not very neat." "No." "But they didn't come back open." "No," Evelyn said. "They didn't." Clara seemed to consider this thoroughly. Then she pressed June against her chest and closed her eyes, and within a few minutes she was asleep again, and Evelyn sat in the chair by the window and watched her daughter breathe, and the afternoon light came in at a low angle and made everything in the room gold and ordinary and entirely sufficient. She sat there for a long time. Clara recovered the way children recover when they're fundamentally healthy, fast enough to make the fear you felt during the illness seem disproportionate, which was its own particular relief. Within 3 days, she was back in the sunroom with June and Button, holding court over nothing in particular, her voice carrying through the floorboards in that low, continuous murmur that had become, without Evelyn fully noticing, one of the sounds she listened for. The ranch absorbed the crisis and moved forward, which was what the ranch did. There was always something that needed doing, and the doing of it had a way of filling in the space left by fear, once the fear had no more justification. Graham went back to his regular hours. Thomas went back to the stable, this time holding the grain bucket with both hands in a way that was so deliberate it was almost funny. Margaret went back to her careful, measured existence, but with the history book from the sitting room shelf tucked under her arm now, which she had not had before, and which was small, but which Evelyn noticed. What nobody went back to exactly was the particular quality of distance that had characterized the first 2 weeks. It wasn't that anything dramatic had changed. It was more that the fever had burned off a thin layer of something, a layer of performance maybe, or of posturing. And what was underneath turned out to be people who had shared something real, sitting around a table together and eating breakfast. Evelyn kept making her record. It was a habit by now, the observing and cataloging, and she no longer questioned why she was doing it. She was doing it because it was the only honest thing she knew how to do with a situation that kept being harder to categorize than she'd expected. The morning of the fourth day after Clara's fever broke, she was in the kitchen garden again. The crooked carrots had been sorted out, mostly, and she'd been working on the east corner where something leafy had been planted at some point and then left to proliferate without supervision. She was on her knees in the dirt, which she did not mind. She had spent enough of her life trying to look like she didn't belong on her knees in dirt that she'd eventually stopped pretending, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Margaret standing at the garden edge. Margaret was holding the history book. She had the look she sometimes got when she'd decided to say something and was still negotiating with herself about whether to actually say it. Evelyn waited. "He lost brothers," Margaret said. Evelyn sat back on her heels. "What?" "Graham." Margaret looked at the book in her hands rather than at her mother. "I asked him last night why he had so many books about medicine. He has 4 of them on the bottom shelf. I noticed after Clara got sick." She paused. "He said he lost 2 brothers when he was young, to fever. He said when he was a boy he kept thinking there had to be something in a book somewhere that could have told him what to do." Evelyn looked at her daughter. "He doesn't talk about it like it's... He didn't make it a big thing," Margaret said, still looking at the book. "He just said it plainly, like he was telling me what the weather was last Tuesday." She paused again. "I thought you should know." "Why?" Evelyn asked quietly. Margaret looked up then. The expression on her face was complicated in the way that 14-year-olds were complicated. Multiple things happening at once, none of them fully worked out. "Because you keep waiting for him to decide we're too much," she said. "And I think maybe that's not what's actually happening." Evelyn held her daughter's gaze for a moment. She was aware, with the specific awareness that came from knowing someone's face since before it had any of its current angles, that this had cost Margaret something to say. Not because Margaret didn't believe it, she clearly did, but because Margaret had built a very careful interior structure around not trusting things too soon, and saying that out loud was a small demolition. "Thank you," Evelyn said, and meant it in several directions at once. Margaret nodded once, in the manner of someone who has said what they came to say and is now finished, and went back inside. Evelyn turned back to the garden and stayed there a while without doing much to it. 4 medical books on the bottom shelf. A boy who lost 2 brothers and looked for answers in pages he couldn't find in time. She thought about the night he'd ridden 12 miles in the dark for a child who wasn't his. She thought about the way he'd sat across the bed without needing to explain himself, without making it into anything larger than what it was. She thought about his hand on her shoulder for one brief second at dawn, and how he'd gone downstairs immediately after, as if even that small thing had been more than he meant to offer. She was building a picture. She had been building it for weeks, one careful tile at a time, and she was starting to see the shape of it, and the shape was not the shape she'd expected when she'd stepped off a stagecoach in Millhaven with 3 children and $14 and a plan to be useful and unobtrusive until the other shoe dropped. The other shoe was beginning to seem less inevitable than she'd planned for. She was not ready to say that out loud. Not yet. But she sat in the garden in the September morning and she let the thought exist without immediately locking it away, which was as close to hope as she'd let herself get since Robert died. It was enough, for now. It was a start. What came 3 days later came without warning, which was how most things that mattered came in Evelyn's experience. Not in a dramatic moment that announced itself, but in an ordinary evening that turned without signaling the turn. She had been awake since 2 a.m. with a headache that had developed into something meaner than the last one, the kind that sat behind both eyes and made the inside of her skull feel too small. She had lain in bed until 4 reasoning with it, and then given up reasoning and gotten up because lying down made it worse. She had come downstairs to find something cold to put on the back of her neck, and had ended up sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with a damp cloth and a glass of water, which was where she was when she heard it. Not in the house. Outside. A sound she didn't recognize at first. Low, rhythmic, somewhere between a voice and not a voice. She sat still and listened, and after a moment she realized it was coming from the direction of the small outbuilding east of the barn, Graham's workshop. There was a light in the window. She sat at the table and told herself it was none of her business. A man had the right to be in his own workshop at 4 a.m, if he wanted to. She sat there for 4 minutes, which she counted because that was the kind of thing she did, and then she put on her coat over her nightgown, which was not a dignified look, and went outside. The night was cold and clear and enormous, the kind of September night in Wyoming that reminded you, without any particular cruelty, that the world did not scale itself to the people living in it. The stars were the same abundance as always. Her boots were damp in the grass. She knocked on the workshop door lightly, so as not to startle. There was a pause, then the door opened. Graham looked at her with the expression of a man who had been caught doing something he hadn't particularly hidden, but hadn't anticipated anyone noticing. He was holding a piece of worked leather in one hand and a small tool in the other, and there were wood shavings on the floor at his feet, and the smell of pine and something oiled and worked. "Your head?" he said. She blinked. "How did you had that look at supper." He stepped back to let her in. "The one where you're trying not to show something hurts." She came in because it was cold outside and because she was already there. The workshop was small and warm from a low stove in the corner. There was a workbench along one wall with tools hung above it in order, and a project in various stages of completion on the bench. She could see it was a small bookshelf, half-finished, the kind that might sit in a child's room. She looked at it. He followed her gaze and looked at it too, and there was a brief silence. "For the upstairs rooms," he said. "I said they were sparse." "You said that a month ago." "I've been getting to it." He set the leather and the tool down and crossed to a small shelf near the stove where a coffee pot sat. "Sit down if you want. Coffee will make the headache worse, but it's better than nothing." She sat on the stool near the workbench. He poured 2 cups with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had stopped performing hospitality and was just doing it. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "I don't sleep much." He handed her the cup. "Never have. 4 hours and I'm done." "That's not enough." "It's what I've got." He leaned against the workbench and drank his coffee. "You get used to it. You find things to do." She looked around the workshop. The ordered tools, the half-finished shelf, the evidence of work done in the hours when the rest of the world was unconscious. "You built this whole shop at 4 in the morning?" "Mostly." Something close to dry amusement in his voice. "Didn't have much else going on." She turned the coffee cup in her hands, which were still slightly cold from the walk over. The headache was receding a little, whether from the position or the warmth or just from having something to focus on other than it. "Margaret told me," she said, "about your brothers." He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't betray a confidence," Evelyn said quickly. I think she was trying to tell me something. About you." He looked at his coffee. "What did she say?" "That you lost them to fever when you were young, and that you have 4 medical books on the bottom shelf." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. "James was 9, he said after a moment. "Will was 12. It went through the county that summer. Took a lot of children." He paused. "I was 15, old enough to understand what was happening and not old enough to do anything about it." Evelyn didn't say she was sorry. She had learned from the long experience of people saying it to her that sorry had a particular uselessness in certain contexts. She just let him keep going, or not, whichever he chose. "My mother had this way of folding her hands," Graham said slowly, "when she was worried. Fingers interlaced, just pressed together. I watched her do it for 3 weeks straight, and then Will died, and she unfolded them, and she never folded them that way again. Like she stopped needing to brace for it because the thing had already come." He stopped. He looked at the stove. "I went through every book I could find afterward," he said. "There weren't many. Thought if I could understand what happened, it would... I don't know what I thought it would do. It didn't do anything, but I kept buying them anyway for years. Different ones. Better ones." A pause. "I still can't tell you I understand it." "No," Evelyn said. "You can't understand it. You just survive it." He looked at her. "Robert went fast," she said, and the sentence sat there between them, flat and real. 4 days from healthy to gone. And I kept thinking, if I'd called for the doctor a day earlier, if I'd recognized what it was sooner, There's a lot of if." She paused. "There isn't a book that helps with the if." "No," he said, "there isn't." The stove ticked in the silence. Outside, something moved in the grass, a night animal going about its business. "When Clara got sick," he said more carefully, I could see it on your face, what you were thinking. Was it that obvious? To me, a pause. I wasn't sure what to say, so You went for the doctor, she said. It was the only useful thing I could think of. He said it without any expectation of credit for it, just stated it, plain, like it was the only reasonable response to the situation, and he was faintly puzzled that it required acknowledgement. Evelyn looked at this man in his workshop at 4 a.m, with wood shavings on his boots and coffee going cold in his hand, and she thought about the record she'd been keeping. All the small, unperformed things. The fire when she overslept. The chair for Clara. The stitches on June's seam that were crooked but didn't come open. The bookshelf half finished in the dark because he'd said the rooms were sparse and he was getting to it. She thought about her plan, the one she'd made on the stagecoach. Be useful. Be unobtrusive. Wait for the cost to appear. The cost had not appeared. Either it was coming, which she couldn't rule out, or the plan had been built on an assumption that was not accurate about this particular situation. She was a woman who revised her assumptions when the evidence required it. She had always believed that. She had just not been tested on it in a while. Graham, she said. He looked at her. I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. He nodded once. I came here with a plan, she said, to take up as little space as possible, to be what was needed and ask for nothing extra and make sure the children were quiet, small, easy to have around. She paused. I have been managing the situation the way I manage everything, which is by anticipating the moment it falls apart and trying to delay it. He was listening. I'm aware, she said, that I haven't been easy to read, that I've been here without being fully here, and I'm not sure I'm capable of being different immediately, because I don't think that's how people change. She stopped. But I wanted to tell you that I see what you've been doing. I've been watching very carefully, and I see it, and I don't take it for granted. She looked at her coffee. That's what I wanted to say. The workshop was very quiet. Okay, Graham said. She looked up. That's it? What else would I say? Most people would say, I don't know, something. He thought about this honestly, which was something she'd noticed he did, actually thought about things before he responded instead of producing the first available answer. You said you needed me to hear it, he said. I heard it. A pause. I don't think you need me to make a speech about it. She laughed, which surprised both of them. A short, involuntary sound that she hadn't generated in weeks, maybe months. It wasn't a big laugh, but it was real. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't quite seen from him before. Startled, and then something softer than startled, and then back to his usual steadiness. Your headache better? He asked. Somewhat. Go sleep. I'll finish this in an hour. She stood up and gave him back the coffee cup and went to the door. The night outside was still enormous and cold. She stood in the doorway for a second. The shelf, she said, without turning around. Will you make one for Thomas too? He's running out of floor space for the books. A pause. Already planned on it, he said. She went back across the dark yard and into the house, and she went upstairs and she lay down in her room, and this time she slept. The conversation at the workshop was not the kind of thing that rearranged everything overnight. That was not how either of them worked. But it made a difference of the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind where two people have acknowledged a thing to each other and can no longer entirely pretend it wasn't acknowledged. The days that followed had a slightly different quality than the days before. Not warmer, exactly. Warmer was the wrong word. More real, maybe. Less managed. Evelyn still made breakfast and kept the kitchen and pulled back when she felt herself reaching forward, because 15 years of habits did not dissolve in a month. But the pulling back felt different now. It felt like a habit she was watching herself do, rather than a necessary survival strategy she didn't question. Graham, for his part, continued being exactly who he had been since the beginning, which she was beginning to understand was not performance, but simply consistency. He got up before the sun. He answered Thomas's questions. He left the last biscuit. He didn't mention the bookshelf again until it was finished, which took 2 more weeks of 4 a.m. hours. And when it appeared in Thomas's room one morning, without announcement, Thomas stood in front of it for a long moment, and then went downstairs and said to Graham simply, "Thank you for the shelf." "Needed a place for the books," Graham said. "You built it yourself." Workshop was just sitting there. Thomas looked at him with that filing away expression. "You do that a lot," he said. "You do something and then you make it sound like you just happened to." Graham looked at him over his coffee. "Do I?" "You do." Thomas sat down. Robert did the opposite. He'd do something ordinary and describe it like it was harder than it was. Not to be dishonest, just that's how he was. The kitchen went briefly quiet. Thomas had mentioned his father a handful of times since the stable incident, each time a little more steadily than the last, like a wound that was not healed but was at least being left alone long enough to try. "Sounds like he was a man who wanted to be seen working," Graham said carefully. "Yeah." Thomas turned his glass around on the table. "I think he needed that sometimes. He wasn't bad. He just needed people to know when things were hard. Lots of people are like that." "You're not." Graham drank his coffee and said nothing, which Thomas appeared to accept as a response. Evelyn, standing at the stove with her back to them, did not turn around for a moment. She was listening to her son talk about his father with a kind of plain, undefended clarity that he hadn't been capable of 3 months ago. And she was thinking about all the ways that grief moved through people. Not in straight lines, not on any schedule, but in its own circuitous, stubborn way, finding exits when it found them. She was also thinking about what Thomas had said. You do something, and then you make it sound like you just happened to. She had been keeping a record all these weeks. What she was beginning to understand was that Graham had been keeping nothing at all. Not a record, not a ledger, not a running account of what he'd given and what he was owed. He'd simply been doing what seemed necessary, at 4 in the morning and midnight and all the hours in between, and he had not been building a case for himself. He had just been building a bookshelf. There was a particular kind of person, Evelyn was coming to understand, who expressed everything through what they made and fixed and tended, and who were largely indifferent to whether anyone noticed. She had thought such people were naive. She was revising that. She thought now that they might simply be the kind of people who had decided something a long time ago about what mattered and had never seen the need to renegotiate. It was late October now. The mornings had turned sharp at the edges, and the cottonwoods outside the kitchen window were going gold in a way that would have been beautiful if Evelyn had let herself stop working long enough to look at them. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she stood at the window with her hands still in the wash basin and looked at the light coming through the yellow leaves and felt something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. She was aware, without having made any formal decision, that the marriage formalization she had been circling for 2 months had stopped feeling like a cliff edge. It had started feeling more like a door. She hadn't opened it yet. She was still standing outside it, but she was looking at the door. The moment that moved the needle, the thing she hadn't anticipated that came from the direction she'd been least watching, happened on a Tuesday afternoon when she was not there for it. She heard about it after. Margaret came to find her in the garden, 2 weeks after the conversation in the workshop. It was 4 in the afternoon and the light was low and amber, and Margaret's expression was the one she only got when something had genuinely reached her. Not the careful, arranged face she usually wore, but the one underneath it, which was younger and less defended and showed the girl she still was underneath all the competence. "I have to tell you something," she said. "Come here." Evelyn straightened up from the row she'd been working and brushed her hands on her apron. Margaret came to the edge of the garden. She was holding herself with a different tension than usual. Not the controlled kind. Something looser. Something that looked like it might, if she let it, become something else. "He was fixing the fence on the north side this afternoon," she said. "The one by the road. Thomas and I went out to watch the horses in the pasture, and he was there working, and—" She stopped. "Go on." "He didn't know we were there at first. And then he saw us, and he came over the fence, and he asked Thomas to hand him the post driver. And Thomas handed it wrong. He's 8, he doesn't know. And Graham showed him how to hold it, and then he let him do it, the post driving." She stopped again. "And when Thomas got it right, the post went in straight, Graham put his hand on his shoulder, just for a second, like it was nothing." Evelyn waited. "And then he looked up and saw me watching," Margaret said. "And he didn't make a thing of it. He just asked if I wanted to try." She looked at her hands. "I said no, but he asked." "What did you say to him?" Evelyn asked quietly. Nothing, then. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. The amber light moved in the cottonwoods above them. After Thomas went back to the stable, I went over to where he was working, and I said— She stopped, and Evelyn watched her daughter's jaw work, watched her push through whatever was making it hard. I said thank you for what he did when Clara was sick, for going for the doctor. What did he say? He said that she was worth going for. Margaret's voice had gone slightly uneven. Just that. He didn't say anything else. He went back to the fence. She pressed her lips together. And then I said my father used to take me to see horses when I was small, before Thomas was born. Just us. He would lift me up so I could pet their noses. She was looking at a point somewhere past Evelyn's shoulder. I don't know why I said that. I don't usually say things like that. What did he say? He stopped working. He looked at me and he said, Tell me about him. What was he like? Margaret blinked once. Nobody's asked me that in 2 years, not like that. Not like they actually wanted to know. Evelyn felt something split open in her chest, clean and aching and real. So I told him, Margaret said, a little, about the horses and about how he used to whistle when he cooked and how he could fix anything except the front gate latch, which he worked on probably 20 times, and it was still broken when he died. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, and Graham listened. He didn't say Robert would have wanted me to be happy or anything like that. He just listened. Then what? Margaret looked at her mother, straight at her, which she didn't always do. Then I said he wasn't so bad. A pause. Graham. I said he wasn't so bad. Another pause. He said thank you, very serious, like I'd given him something important. The corner of her mouth moved. I think I did. Evelyn stood in the garden in the amber October light and looked at her firstborn daughter, the child who had folded herself small for 2 years, who had decided that caution was safer than being hurt, who had built walls out of capability and efficiency and careful distance. And she was watching those walls not fall exactly, but develop, in one specific place, a door-sized gap. She crossed the distance between them, and she put both arms around her daughter, who was almost as tall as she was now, which she hadn't fully registered until this moment. Margaret went stiff for half a second. She always did, it was the automatic response. And then she didn't. She put her arms around her mother and held on for a moment that was longer than Evelyn had expected, and neither of them said anything. When Margaret pulled back, she pressed the back of her wrist quickly against one eye, then the other, with the determined efficiency of someone who had decided what she was going to feel and how much of it. He's not replacing Papa, she said. I know that. I know you know, Evelyn said. He's different. He's a different kind of— She stopped, searching for the word. Person, Evelyn offered. Yeah. Margaret straightened her dress. Person. She looked at the garden. Your carrots are still crooked. I'm aware. You should mound the soil higher around the base. Thank you, Margaret. Her daughter's mouth twitched again, almost definitely a smile this time, and she went back toward the house with the slightly lighter step of someone who has put something down after carrying it for a long time and is still getting used to the absence of the weight. Evelyn stood in the garden until the light went flat, and the cottonwood stopped being gold and became just trees in the dusk. And then she went inside and she made supper, and they all sat at the table, all 5 of them, and Button under Thomas's chair in blatant violation of a rule that nobody enforced anymore, and ate together. At some point during the meal, Graham looked up and saw something in her face that made him go briefly still. She didn't know what he saw. She didn't look away, which was the closest thing to honesty she was capable of right now, and after a moment he went back to his supper without saying anything, which was, she was learning, exactly what it meant when he said enough. The first frost came on a Thursday. Evelyn woke to it before she saw it. A particular quality to the air coming under the window she'd left cracked, something crisper and more final than the cold that had been building through October. She lay still for a moment and identified it, and then she got up and looked out the window at the yard, where the grass had gone silver and the water trough near the stable had a thin skin of ice across the top that caught the early light. November had arrived without asking anyone's permission, which was what November did. She dressed and went downstairs and found, as she had found most mornings for the past 6 weeks, that the fire was already going. Graham had been up before her again. She had stopped being surprised by this and had started, quietly, being grateful for it. Not in the performed way she'd been grateful for things in the first weeks, the careful accounting of debts, but in the simpler way of someone who noticed a kindness and let it be a kindness without immediately calculating what it cost. That was a change. She was aware of it. She didn't examine it too closely because, in her experience, examining a change too closely was a good way to talk yourself out of it. She was making the biscuits when she heard Thomas on the stairs, then his boots on the kitchen floor, then the small specific sound of him stopping in the doorway. "There's frost," he said. "There is. The trough is frozen. Graham will have handled it." Thomas came into the kitchen and sat at the table, pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders with the slightly uncoordinated energy of a boy who had recently grown half an inch and hadn't fully reconciled himself with his own dimensions. He would be 9 in February. He had arrived at the ranch as a child who asked too many questions and had been, in some essential way she couldn't quite name, waiting for someone with the patience to answer them. He had found that, and the effect had been a kind of slow, steady unfurling, a boy becoming more himself rather than less, which was what happened when children felt safe. "He let me break the ice yesterday," Thomas said, "with the hammer. He showed me how to do it so it doesn't crack the trough." "I heard." "Did he tell you?" "I heard you telling Clara at supper, in detail." Thomas had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I was being informative." "You were." He pulled the book from under his arm. He had taken to carrying the natural history volume everywhere, supplemented now by 2 others Graham had quietly produced from somewhere, and opened it on the table. But he didn't read it. He sat with his chin in his hand and looked at the window, where the frost on the outside was beginning to melt at the edges as the sun came up. "Mama," he said. "Are we staying?" She set down the biscuit cutter and turned around. Thomas was looking at her with the careful, direct expression he used when he was asking something he'd been thinking about for a long time and had finally decided to say out loud. He was not, she realized, looking for reassurance. He was asking an actual question because he wanted an actual answer, which was the kind of child he was. She came to the table and sat across from him because he deserved that, deserved her sitting down rather than answering from across the room while she kept working. "What made you ask this morning?" she said. "I've been asking it in my head for a while." He closed the book. I want to know. It's better to know things than to not know them." She looked at her son, his father's jaw, his father's directness, but something in the eyes that was entirely his own, a particular steady curiosity that had been there since he was old enough to have eyes worth looking at. "I'm working on staying," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. He thought about this. "That means you're not sure yet. That means I'm sure about more than I was, and I'm getting surer. Because of Graham? That's part of it." Thomas nodded slowly, in the manner of someone updating an internal document. "He's not like what I thought a frontier rancher would be." "What did you think he'd be?" "I don't know. Rougher." He turned his book over in his hands. "Louder, less..." He searched for the word. "He thinks before he talks. Most grown men don't do that." "No," she agreed. "They don't." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I think we should stay," he said, with the particular confidence of an 8-year-old stating something that seemed obvious. "I think this is the right place." A pause. "I think he wants us here. Not because he's supposed to, because he actually does." Evelyn looked at her son and felt the familiar ache of loving someone so much that their clarity hurt you. Because he was right, and because being right at 8 years old required a kind of uncomplicated seeing that adults worked very hard to unlearn, and she had spent 2 years unlearning it, and she was not entirely sure she was done. "Go get your coat," she said, "and ask Margaret to come down." He went. She stayed at the table for a moment before going back to the biscuits, and she thought about what he'd said. He actually does. Not the politeness of a man fulfilling an obligation, not the performance of someone waiting out the difficulty, something that had been, from the beginning, simply true. She thought about the workshop at 4 a.m, the bookshelf that appeared without announcement, the stitches on June's seam, crooked and firm, the 12 miles in the dark. She thought about Robert. She had been doing that less lately, which produced in her a complicated feeling, not guilt exactly, but a kind of tender uncertainty, Like she wasn't sure whether the lessening was a betrayal or healing, or both simultaneously. She had loved Robert without reservation, and losing him had broken something in her that she had spent 2 years telling herself would never fully close. She was not sure anymore whether she had been right about that. She was not sure the break was the permanent thing she'd convinced herself it was. That was the most frightening thing, not Graham. Graham had turned out to be a manageable kind of frightening. It was the possibility of her own heart that scared her most. The conversation happened the following evening, and it was not the conversation she had planned. She had not planned a conversation at all. It arrived the way things arrived in this house, without warning, out of the ordinary material of an ordinary evening, because that was where real things happened. Supper was finished. Claire had been put to bed early, still needing more sleep than usual in the aftermath of the fever. Thomas had retreated to his room with his books, which was where he spent most evenings now. Margaret had offered to do the dishes, which she did sometimes. Not from obligation, but from the particular desire of someone who needed to be useful while they were thinking about something. Evelyn had let her. She found Graham on the front porch. He was sitting on the step, not doing anything, which was unusual enough that it stopped her in the doorway for a second. He was just looking out at the dark yard, at the cottonwoods that had lost most of their leaves now, and the thin slice of moon that had appeared over the tree line. She came and sat on the step beside him, not quite the same distance apart as that first night weeks ago. Closer, but not so close it announced anything. She had been adjusting distances without fully acknowledging that she was doing it, and this was one of those adjustments. The night was cold and very still. "She's down?" he asked. Finally, she fought it. She always fights it. This was true. Claire had not, in all the weeks since their arrival, gone to bed without some version of a negotiation. It was one of the few places where her determined nature surfaced in an inconvenient direction. "She told me tonight that she doesn't need as much sleep as I think she does," Evelyn said. "What'd you say?" "I said she could take that up with me in the morning." Something shifted in Graham's expression that was as close to a grin as he usually got. A brief, unguarded loosening that appeared and disappeared quickly. She had learned to watch for it. They sat in the quiet for a moment. The cottonwoods moved without sound. The horses were settled. "Graham," she said. "Yeah." She had been composing this for several days. Not the exact words, she had never worked well from a script, but the general shape of what needed to be said. She had been carrying it around the way you carried something fragile, checking on it periodically to see if it had broken yet. "When I got off that stagecoach," she said, "I told you no man would want a wife who comes with 3 children, and you said—" "I said I'd always wanted a large family." "Yes." She looked at the slice of moon. "I didn't believe you." "I know. I spent a long time not believing you." She paused. "I've been waiting for you to show me I was right not to reach your limit, to decide we were too much." She stopped. "I think I'm still waiting, partly. I don't think that's something I can just turn off." He was listening. She could feel that he was listening the way he always listened, completely, without preparing his response while she was still talking. "But I've also been watching," she said, "every day. I've been paying attention to what you do when you don't think anyone's looking, because that's the only thing that actually tells you who someone is." She looked at her hands. "And what I've seen—" She stopped again because the next part was the part she'd been carrying carefully, and she needed to get it right. "What I've seen is someone who is just good. Not in a showy way, not in a way that asks for anything back, just steady and decent and good." She breathed out. "And I don't know how to accept that without being afraid of it. I've been afraid of it this whole time. I'm telling you that because you deserve to know it, not because I want you to fix it." The porch was quiet. Graham was looking at the yard. She could see from this angle the line of his jaw and the slight tension in his shoulders that told her the stillness he projected was being generated by effort rather than indifference. He was feeling something. He was just waiting until he'd sorted it enough to say it. "I built this house bigger than I needed," he said. "When I built it, 8 years ago. My neighbor thought I'd lost my mind, single man, no family, putting up 2 stories with 3 bedrooms. He paused. "I told him I was planning ahead. He thought I meant for property value. She waited. I used to eat supper standing at the kitchen counter, he said, because sitting at the table by myself felt like something I was doing wrong, like I'd built a dining table for people who weren't there, and sitting at it alone was just pointing at the fact. He stopped. I ate at that counter for 4 years before I wrote to the service. Evelyn looked at him. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me, he said, with a slight roughness in his voice that told her he meant it. I'm telling you because you said we should know things about each other, and that's something true. He was quiet for a moment. I wrote 3 letters before I sent one, threw the first 2 away. Felt like I was admitting something I wasn't sure I had the right to want. What did you want? She asked, quietly. He looked at the moon. What I have now, he said. The noise? The questions? Somebody to share the work with. A pause. Button sleeping under the kitchen table even though I told him not to. The slight loosening at the corner of his mouth again. I want this. Whatever this is. It's complicated, Evelyn said. Yes. We are not. None of us are easy. I'm aware. He turned to look at her then, directly, in the way he didn't always do. Not because he avoided it, but because he was careful with it, the way he was careful with most things that mattered. I don't want easy. Easy was 4 years eating at a counter by myself. She looked back at him, and there was a long moment that was not uncomfortable in the way she would have expected a moment like this to be. Just 2 people on a porch step in the cold, seeing each other clearly. I've been making it hard for you, she said. You've been careful. That's not the same thing. I've been so careful I might have made you feel like nothing you did was ever enough. He was quiet for a second, which told her she was not entirely wrong. There were moments, he said, which was the honest answer, where I wasn't sure whether any of it was landing. It was landing, she said. I couldn't let you see it yet. She paused. I'm telling you now. Graham looked at her for a long moment. He had a very specific way of being still that she had come to understand was not blankness, but the opposite, a kind of full attention that most people expressed by talking or moving, and that he expressed by simply being present and making no noise about it. Okay, he said. She laughed quietly, which she hadn't entirely expected. You say that a lot. It covers most things. She looked at her hands, then back at the yard. I want to stay, she said, which was the simplest and most accurate version of everything she'd been trying to say. I want this to work. I want my children to have this. A pause. And I want to stop being so afraid of wanting that. He reached over and covered her hand with his, briefly, on the cold porch step. His hand was rough from the work, and warm, and he didn't grip, didn't hold, just rested it there for a moment and then took it back. It was not a romantic gesture particularly. It wasn't designed to be. It was just a man telling a woman that he had heard her in the only language he was fluent in, which was the language of quiet and solid and real. She felt it land exactly where he'd meant it. The next morning, Margaret was in the kitchen when Evelyn came downstairs. This was not unusual. Margaret was frequently up and useful before being asked. What was unusual was that she was sitting at the table rather than doing anything, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her expression doing the thing it did when she'd made a decision and hadn't announced it yet. Evelyn poured herself coffee and sat down. They were quiet for a moment. From upstairs came the muffled sound of Thomas dropping something, which was followed by silence, which meant he'd decided it was not worth acknowledging. I've been thinking, Margaret said. About the fact that I've been making myself invisible. She said it bluntly, in the direct way she had when she'd been sitting with a thing long enough to stop being delicate about it. Since we got here. Since before we got here, actually. Since Papa died. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her cup. I thought if I was useful and quiet and didn't need anything, nobody would get tired of us, Margaret said. I thought it was helping. She paused. I think it was actually just, I think I was scared, and it was the only way I knew how to be scared. You were 12, Evelyn said. I know. Margaret looked at her tea. I'm not 12 now. No. I'm tired of making myself small, she said. I'm tired of waiting to see if we're going to get sent away. She looked up. We're not going to get sent away, are we? No. Evelyn said, with more certainty than she'd been able to say it before. We're not. Margaret nodded slowly, something shifting in her face. Not relief, exactly. Or not only relief. Something more like a piece of furniture being moved back to where it was always supposed to be. He asked me last week what I wanted to do, she said. Like, in my life. What I wanted to be. What did you say? I said I hadn't thought about it. She paused, which was a lie. I've thought about it constantly. She stopped. Nobody's asked me that in 2 years. Everyone just tells me what needs doing, and I do it. What did he say? When you told him you hadn't thought about it? The corner of Margaret's mouth moved. He said that was fine. He said I had time. She looked out the window. He said the worst thing a person can do is decide who they are before they've had the chance to find out. Evelyn looked at her firstborn daughter, the girl who had been 12 and folded herself flat and stayed that way, out of love and fear in equal measure, trying to make the family lighter to carry, who had been carrying a grief she'd never been given enough space to put down, who was sitting at a kitchen table on a November morning in Wyoming, saying out loud, for perhaps the first time, that she was tired. What do you want? Evelyn asked. If you could say it. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I want to read everything in that bookshelf, she said finally. And then I want more books. And I want to... She stopped. Tried again. I think I might want to teach. Someday. I'm good at explaining things. You're excellent at explaining things. I explained the water cycle to Clara last week and she understood it. Clara is 6. Exactly. Something in Margaret's face that was definitively, unquestionably a smile this time. Not the near smile she'd been rationing since Robert died. A real one, with her eyes in it. She's sharp, though. She asked me what happened to the water that evaporated from the ocean, and I said it formed clouds, and she said that seemed inefficient. Evelyn laughed. Actually laughed. The full version. And it sounded strange in the kitchen because it had been a while since she'd heard herself do it. Margaret laughed too, and it was a slightly rusty sound, like a door that hadn't been open in too long but opened now just fine. They sat at the table and finished their coffee and tea and let the morning come in around them, the November light low and pale through the window, the frost still thick on the north side of the yard where the sun didn't reach until midday. When Graham came in from the stable, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them at the table, and something passed across his face that Evelyn had not seen there before. A full, unguarded expression that appeared and stayed instead of appearing and retreating. It was a man looking at something he had built a house for and waited years to see, and knowing that was what he was looking at. He came in and poured his coffee and sat down with them, and Thomas came thundering down the stairs a minute later, and Clara followed at her own deliberate pace carrying June, and they all sat around the table in the pale November morning, and Evelyn looked at the 5 of them, at Thomas arguing with himself about something in his book, at Clara explaining something to June in an undertone, at Margaret with her hands around her cup and the real smile still on her face, at Graham who was listening to all of it with the quiet attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. She felt the fear still. It was still there, in the back of her chest where she'd been keeping it. She was not going to pretend it wasn't. But it was smaller than it had been yesterday, and smaller than the day before that. And she understood, with the practical certainty of a woman who had survived 2 years of things she hadn't thought she could survive, that something that kept getting smaller was eventually going to run out of room. She drank her coffee. Outside, the frost was already melting where the sun touched it, and the yard was turning from silver back to its ordinary colors, which were not as striking but were solid and real, and there every morning when she looked out the window. That was enough. That was, she had decided, exactly enough. The wedding was on a Saturday in late November, and it was not a grand affair by any measure that the word grand had ever been applied to anything. Evelyn had not wanted grand. She had wanted real, which was a different thing entirely and considerably harder to arrange, in her experience. Grand was a matter of flowers and dress fabric and who stood where. Real was a matter of who was actually in the room and whether they meant it. The room was the sitting room of the ranch house, which Graham had cleaned the evening before with the focused thoroughness he brought to practical tasks, moving furniture, sweeping twice, bringing in 2 chairs from the kitchen so there was somewhere for Clara to sit that didn't require her to stand on her tiptoes to see. He had done all of this without being asked and without announcing it, which was so consistent with who he was that Evelyn had simply watched him do it and felt the particular warmth that came from knowing someone's patterns well enough to recognize them. The judge who married them was a thin, unhurried man named Caldwell, who rode out from Millhaven on a horse that was markedly better than he was, and who performed the ceremony with the professional brevity of a man who had married a great many frontier couples, and understood that what they needed was the legal fact of it, not the performance. It was over in 11 minutes. What took longer was the part before. The standing in the sitting room with the morning light coming in the east window, Graham in his good shirt with the collar actually buttoned, Evelyn in the blue dress that was the best thing she owned, and the three children arranged beside them in the approximate formation of people who had been told to stand still and were managing it with varying degrees of success. Thomas had his hands clasped behind his back with the focused formality of someone attending an important occasion and determined to behave accordingly. Clara was holding June, which nobody had suggested she not do. Margaret stood on Evelyn's left side, straight-backed, her expression serious in a way that was not grief, but was adjacent to it. The face of someone marking a threshold, understanding what was on both sides of it. Judge Caldwell read his portion. Graham said what he was required to say in his quiet, even voice, looking at Evelyn directly the entire time. Evelyn said hers. Her voice did not waver, which she had not been certain about until it was happening, and then it simply didn't. When it was done, Graham turned to her and she saw, before he put it back, the thing his face did when he forgot to manage it. Not a dramatic expression, just the plain, unguarded fact of a man who had spent 8 years eating supper at a kitchen counter and was standing in his own sitting room with a wife and 3 children on a Saturday morning in November and knew exactly what that meant. She reached up and put her hand briefly against his jaw, which surprised him. She could feel the slight tension of it. And then she let it go, and they both turned back to the room. "Is that it?" Clara asked. "That's it," Evelyn said. Clara appeared to weigh this against some internal standard. "Can we eat now?" "Yes," Graham said. "We can eat now." What followed was the least ceremonial wedding breakfast in the history of matrimony, which was to say it was bacon and eggs and biscuits and coffee, and Thomas spilling his milk within the first 4 minutes, and Margaret catching the glass before it went completely over, and Graham passing Thomas a cloth without making anything of it, and Clara explaining to Judge Caldwell the complete history and significance of June, which the judge listened to with the patient attention of a man who had encountered stranger things and found that listening costs nothing. Caldwell left around 9. Button ate the piece of bacon that fell off Thomas's plate. Evelyn washed the dishes, and Graham dried them, which was not a division of labor they had explicitly established, but which had simply become, over the weeks, the way dishes got done in this house. "Well," Graham said, setting the last cup on the shelf. "Well," she said. He looked at her. The morning light was full in the kitchen now, the particular pale winter light that came in low and direct and made everything look slightly more itself than usual. She looked back at him and thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Millhaven with $6 and 3 children and a plan to take up as little space as possible, and she thought about how wrong that plan had turned out to be, and she was not sorry. "Same as yesterday," he said. "Mostly," she agreed. He nodded once and went out to the stable because the horses didn't care what day it was, and Evelyn stood in her kitchen, she let herself think it, without qualification, and listened to the house around her. Clara's voice from upstairs, the sound of Thomas's boots on the porch, Margaret somewhere, pages turning, same as yesterday. Mostly. The difference was in the architecture of it, not the surface, but the thing underneath, the weight-bearing structure. She had been living in this house for 3 months as a woman waiting to be asked to leave, and she was done with that now. Not because the fear had disappeared entirely. She was too honest with herself to claim that. But because she had decided, finally, actually decided, that she was going to live here fully, which meant taking up the space she was entitled to, which meant letting herself want things without immediately calculating whether the wanting was too much. It was harder than it sounded. She was aware of that. 20 years of the opposite habit did not dissolve in a morning, but she was going to work on it. The first test came 3 days later, and it came from the direction she should have anticipated and didn't. A woman named Helen Marsh, who who owned a small ranch 6 miles east with her husband, came by with a covered dish and the information that Millhaven knew about the marriage. This was not a surprise. News moved through frontier communities the way water moved through anything, along the path of least resistance, which in a small town was the path from one person's mouth to the next. What she hadn't expected was Helen Marsh's particular variety of friendliness, which contained, underneath the dish and the smile, a kind of avid curiosity about the specifics of the arrangement that Evelyn recognized immediately and had spent years learning to deflect. 3 children, Helen said, in the bright pointed way of a woman making a fact into a question. From before. Yes, Evelyn said, and Graham took all 3. Not a question this time. We're a family, Evelyn said. That's how families work. Helen looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had expected to find something more complicated and was slightly disappointed not to. Well, she said, yes, I suppose it is. After she left, Evelyn stood in the kitchen with the covered dish. It was an apple cake which smelled good and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not irritation at Helen Marsh, exactly. More like a clear, settled knowledge of who she was and what this was, and the complete absence of any need to justify it. Helen had been looking for a story. The story she'd been looking for was the one where 3 children and a widow and a rancher had a complicated, fragile arrangement with unclear edges. The story that actually existed was something different, and it didn't require Helen's understanding to be true. She cut the cake and put it on the table for when Thomas got in from the stable. December came, and with it the first serious snow. Evelyn had seen snow. She was not a woman who had been sheltered from weather, but she had not seen Wyoming snow before, which was a different animal from what she'd grown up with. Heavier, more committed, with a wind behind it that had been gathering speed since Canada and had not found anything significant to slow it down before it reached their fence line. The first real storm came on a Wednesday night. By morning, the yard was erased. Everything that had been distinct and separate was unified under white, and the world outside the window had contracted to what was visible from the porch, which was not much. The mountains were completely gone. The cottonwoods were shapes. Graham had prepared for it. She understood that now, looking back at the past 2 weeks. The extra hay in the barn, the stacking of firewood against the side of the house, the caulking he'd done around the kitchen windows one afternoon that she'd noticed but not thought much about. He had been reading the weather the way he read everything, quietly, ahead of time, without announcing what he knew until the knowing became relevant. The horses were already secured when Evelyn came downstairs. The house was warm. The woodbox was full. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs and looked out the window and said, with the contained ecstasy of a child who has never seen anything so profoundly inconvenient and wonderful at the same time, "It's everywhere." "It is," Graham said from the kitchen doorway with his coffee. "Can we go out?" "After breakfast, dress warm." Thomas was already on his way back upstairs at a speed that suggested dressing warm was going to be a brief, optimistic process. Clara came to the window in her nightgown and pressed her nose against the cold glass and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Everything's white." "Everything's white," Graham confirmed. "Even the horses?" "The horses are in the barn." She considered this. Good. She went to get dressed with the deliberate seriousness of someone with places to be. What happened that morning was not dramatic and would not have been remarkable to anyone watching from the outside. They ate breakfast. Thomas went out with Graham to clear the path from the house to the barn, which took an hour and resulted in Thomas being so completely coated in snow that he was indistinguishable from the landscape except for his voice, which remained entirely audible throughout. Clara watched from the window with June, providing ongoing commentary to the doll about the structural properties of snowdrifts. Margaret made a second pot of coffee without being asked and brought a cup to Evelyn, where she stood at the window watching Thomas and Graham work. They stood there together for a moment, mother and daughter, watching the two of them in the white yard. Graham working with steady efficiency, Thomas with enormous enthusiasm and moderate usefulness, both of them occasionally saying something to the other that was too muffled by the snow to hear from inside. "He likes him," Margaret said. "He does. It's good." A pause. Thomas needed that. Someone who doesn't just let him talk but actually talks back, takes him seriously. Evelyn looked at her daughter. "You needed it too." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She drank her coffee. "Yeah," she said finally, without the defensiveness the word might have carried a few months ago. Just an acknowledgement, just true. Yeah, I did. They stood there until Thomas fell into a snowdrift with spectacular commitment, and Graham reached down to pull him out, and both of them stood there for a moment, covered in snow, and something passed between them that was wordless and clear and would not have been possible 3 months ago. That evening, around the fire, Graham asked if they'd had snow like this before, and Thomas launched into a detailed description of a storm in Missouri that had closed the roads for 4 days. And Clara interrupted to correct a detail Thomas had gotten wrong, and Thomas disputed the correction, and the argument that followed was so completely ordinary. The bickering of siblings who had forgotten, temporarily, that they were in the presence of someone they'd been on their best behavior for. That Evelyn looked across the room at Graham and found him watching them with the expression she'd come to know, the one he didn't always catch in time. He caught her looking. She didn't look away. Neither did he. The children were entirely occupied with their argument. It was a small moment. It would not have been visible to anyone else in the room, but it was the kind of small moment that was actually not small at all, the kind that was, quietly, everything. January was hard. There was no point in pretending otherwise, and Evelyn had long since given up the habit of pretending things were easier than they were. The cold was serious and persistent and required constant management, keeping the fire, keeping the animals, keeping the paths clear, keeping the food stores from depleting faster than expected. Graham worked in conditions that would have stopped a less stubborn man and came in at night with hands that she had started rubbing warmth back into without thinking about it, which was the kind of thing you did for someone whose hands you knew. He did not complain. She had not expected him to. What she had not expected was how much she didn't want him to go out some mornings. Not in a suffocating way, just in the plain, clear way of a woman who had come to understand that someone's absence from a room changed the quality of the room, and not for the better. That was new. That was hers, and she sat with it without alarm. There was a night in January, the worst cold of the winter, when the temperature dropped to something that made the house's timbers contract and crack, and the wind found every imperfect seal and tested it, and they ended up all 5 of them in the sitting room with the fire built high because it was the warmest room. And warmth was not a matter of comfort that night, but of actual necessity. Graham fell asleep in the chair, which was something he never did. He was always the last to sleep, the one who checked the fire before going up, the one whose 4 hours of sleep happened in the deep part of the night rather than the evening. But the cold had required more from him that day than usual, and somewhere around 8 o'clock, mid-sentence, he was simply asleep. The children registered this with varying degrees of response. Thomas looked at him and then at Evelyn with a slight smile, then went back to his book. Clara studied Graham's sleeping face with the forensic attention she brought to anything she was trying to understand, then turned to Evelyn and whispered very seriously, "He snores a little." "Shh," Evelyn said. "Only a little," Clara whispered. Margaret, from her chair across the room with her own book open, did not look up, but the corner of her mouth moved. Evelyn sat there in the firelight with her family around her, all of it, the whole inexplicable, assembled, improbable thing, and she let herself feel it without filing it away. She had been filing things away her whole life, building the record, keeping the tally. She was letting some of it just be what it was. The fire shifted. Graham slept. Clara leaned against Evelyn's arm and was asleep herself within 10 minutes, June tucked under her chin, her breathing slow and even, and untroubled in the way that was the particular gift of children who have finally decided they are safe. Thomas lasted another hour before his book dropped and his eyes closed. Margaret lasted longest, reading with the focused absorption of someone who had discovered that books were the place where her mind had enough room, and who was making up for 2 years of not having enough of them. At some point she closed the book and looked at the fire, and then she looked at Graham's sleeping face, and her expression was so complicated and so private that Evelyn looked away to give her the privacy of it. But she had seen, and what she had seen was not grief exactly, or not only grief, it was something more like the expression of someone doing difficult internal arithmetic, adding one thing to another, finding that the sum was not a betrayal, but an expansion, and sitting with the surprise of that. She had been watching all of them do that arithmetic for months. She had been doing it herself. It took the time it took. That was the thing nobody told you, how long it took, and how it didn't happen all at once, and how the heart was not a simple system that switched cleanly between states. It was a complicated, stubborn thing that moved in its own direction at its own speed, and all you could do was not get in its way. February came, and Thomas turned 9, and Graham took him to the stable on his birthday and let him lead Ezra, the Morgan, the difficult one, the one that had spooked at the dropped bucket all those months ago, through a full loop of the paddock. Thomas came back inside, vibrating with a satisfaction too large for his body to contain, and described every step of it twice, and the second telling was better than the first. He trusted you, Graham told him. Ezra doesn't trust easy. Thomas looked at him. Neither do the people in this family. It was so direct and so accurate that nobody said anything for a second. No, Graham said, but they get there. And that was when Margaret said it. She had come in from outside while this was happening. She had been to the barn to return a tool she'd borrowed, and nobody had asked her to return it today. She had just done it. And she was standing at the edge of the kitchen doorway with her coat still on and her hair windblown, and she had heard the last part. They get there, she repeated. Graham looked at her. She unwound her scarf from her neck. She got there, she said, with a slight tilt of her head toward Evelyn. Thomas got there. Clara was always, Clara's Clara, she decides things fast. She hung up her coat on the hook by the door, which was her hook, which she had claimed without anyone assigning it, which was one of the small permanent things that had happened without announcement. I got there too. She turned around. I know I made it difficult. Margaret, Evelyn started. I'm not apologizing, Margaret said clearly. I just want to say it out loud that I know. She looked at Graham. You didn't push. You could have. You didn't. A pause. That mattered. Graham looked at her. He let a moment go by before he answered, which was his way, the thing Thomas had described months ago, thinking before talking. You had good reasons for being careful, he said. I wasn't going to argue with that. Margaret held his gaze for a moment with the directness she'd inherited from somewhere in her lineage that Evelyn had never fully traced. We needed someone who wasn't going to argue with that, she said. So, she picked up her book from the table where she'd left it. Good that it was you. She went upstairs. Graham looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Graham. Thomas looked at both of them with the expression of a boy who was going to be asking questions about this conversation later and was giving them fair warning. She's something, Graham said. She is, Evelyn agreed. She's going to run something someday. A school, or a county, or something. I know. Evelyn felt the particular pride that lived in the specific place behind the sternum, the kind that ached a little because it was too large for the space. She's been that way since she was small. We just had a rough few years. Past tense, he said. She looked at him. Rough few years, he said. Past tense. She thought about that. About the specific weight of past tense. The way it sat differently from present tense, with more air around it. The way it allowed you to turn and look at something rather than being inside it. Past tense, she agreed. What happened after that was not a single moment, but an accumulation of them, which was how most real things were built. Spring came back to Wyoming in the particular way spring came there, without gentleness, announcing itself through mud and snow melt and the sound of the creek running fast. And then one morning, the cottonwoods showed the first suggestion of green and the world changed its mind about being winter. Thomas took on more of the stable work, real work now, not observed work. Graham showed him how to assess a horse's gait for lameness and how to tell by the smell of the hay whether it had gotten damp during storage. And Thomas absorbed all of it and asked 43 questions per lesson and remembered everything. There was a boy becoming a horseman somewhere in that process, slow and uneven and absolutely real. Clara, who had spent the winter in a sustained investigation of every corner of the ranch that was accessible to a 6-year-old with a determined personality, declared in March that the patch of ground behind the kitchen garden was going to be her garden. Nobody had given it to her. She had assessed the available options and made a unilateral decision. She began preparing it with the small shovel Graham produced from the workshop without comment, and she consulted with Evelyn about what to plant, and she made a plan in the serious, methodical way she made all plans, and then she executed the plan with imperfect but committed results. She grew carrots that were mostly straight and beans that came up tangled, and 3 kinds of flowers she'd chosen herself, and she approached the entire enterprise with the satisfaction of someone who has discovered that she is capable of making things grow. June presided over the garden from a spot near the fence. Button supervised from a comfortable distance. Graham, walking by one afternoon, stopped and looked at the beans. "They're coming in," he said. "They're confused," Clara told him seriously, "but they're trying." "That's most things," he said. She looked up at him. She had been doing this periodically for months now, studying him with those dark eyes that missed nothing, updating whatever internal assessment she was running. "Graham," she said. "Yeah. I think you're a good person." He was quiet for a moment. "I think you're a good person too." She appeared to accept this as a satisfactory exchange of information and went back to her beans. He stood there a second longer, and then he walked on. And Evelyn, who had heard all of it from the kitchen window where she was grinding coffee, stood very still for a moment before she went back to what she was doing. The evening of the first warm day in April, genuinely warm, the kind where you could sit outside after supper without a coat. They were all on the porch. Graham in the chair, Evelyn on the step, Thomas on the rail, which he'd been told not to sit on, but the telling had become increasingly perfunctory on both sides. Clara on the step below Evelyn, with Button and June. Margaret leaning against the post with her book, though the light was going too low for reading and she was really just holding it. The mountains were visible again, blue and clean against the sky. Clara was the one who said it. She said it the way she said most things, without preamble, in the middle of something else, as if it had simply arrived at the front of her mind and come out. "Dad?" she said, then stopped. Nobody moved. She was talking to Graham. She was looking at June, then she looked up at him, and her expression was not the careful expression of a child who has said something intentionally freighted. It was the plain expression of a child who has called someone what she has decided to call them, simple as that. Graham looked at her. Something happened in his face. Not dramatic. He was not a dramatic man, but something that he did not catch in time or try to. "Yeah," he said quietly. "The beans are going to need more water tomorrow," she said. "The ground was dry today." "I'll get to it," he said. She nodded and went back to June. Thomas was looking at the mountains very intently, in the way of a boy who is feeling something large and has decided that looking at something large is the appropriate response. Margaret turned a page she hadn't read. Evelyn sat on the step in the April evening and looked at the mountains too, and she thought about a woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 8 months ago, convinced that hope was not a strategy. She thought about what hope had turned out to be instead. Not a plan, not a guarantee, not a promise that nothing would go wrong. Just the insistence on remaining open to what was possible. The refusal to decide in advance that the best thing was already behind you. She had not been good at that. She was still not entirely good at it. She was a work in progress on that particular question, and she expected she would be for some time. But she was here. They were here. All 5 of them on a porch in Wyoming in the first real warmth of spring, and the mountains were back after the winter, and the cottonwoods were green again, and somewhere in the kitchen garden the carrots were coming up, probably still crooked. Some things didn't change. You learned to work with them. She reached back and put her hand over Graham's where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his palm up and held it. And they sat like that while the light finished going and the stars came out one by one over the mountains. The ranch was never going to be the easiest life. She had stopped expecting easy. Easy was not the thing. The thing was this: a house that knew their footsteps, children who were becoming themselves, a man who had built 3 bedrooms and waited and turned out to be exactly what he said he was, which was the most uncommon thing she'd ever encountered. The fear did not disappear. She was honest enough to know it would return, in new forms, about new things, because that was the cost of loving people, the knowledge of what you had to lose. But it no longer had the last word. It was a voice in the room, and there were other voices now, louder and more insistent, and they sounded like Thomas asking 40 questions, and Clara's consultation with a cloth doll, and Margaret's laugh when something was genuinely funny, and Graham's quiet, steady answer to whatever was asked of him. They sounded like a family. The particular, imperfect, assembled kind. The kind that nobody plans for and everybody, underneath, is hoping for. The kind that is built not from a single decision, but from 1,000 small ones. From fires started before anyone wakes. From stitches that are crooked but don't come open. From questions answered honestly. From patience that does not require recognition. From a man who said, "I've always wanted a large family," like it was simply a true thing. And a woman who finally, after long enough, decided to let it be.